I wonder, does the name George Ade mean anything to you? I like to think it does, for the most personal possible reasons. Because my name is George Orson Welles. I didn't drop the George. That was done for me before I had any voice in the matter, and I'm proud, at least, that it's there on my birth certificate. Well, George Ade, in his day, one of the giants, was my godfather. And he wrote some big hits for the Broadway stage, but if he's remembered now at all, and he should never be forgotten, it's for his fables in slang. Now, here's a sample page. Note the eccentric use of the capital letters. And try to imagine them, please, as we go along. I'm going to read to you the fable of the good fairy with the lorgnette and why she got it good. Once upon a time, there was a broad girl who had nothing else to do and no children to look after, so she thought she would be benevolent. She'd scared all the red corpuscles out of the 2x4 midget who rotated about her in a limited orbit and was known by courtesy as her husband. He was soft for her, and so she got it mapped out with herself that she was a superior woman. Her clothes were full of pinholes where she'd been hanging medals on herself. And she used to go on a handball court every day and throw up bouquets, letting him bounce back and hit her. The downtrodden man whom she dragged to the altar was afraid of his life. He wasn't strong enough to push her in front of a cable car, and he didn't have the nerve to get a divorce, so he stood for everything. But he used to go out with a few friends and tell him his troubles and weep into his beer. They would slap him on the back and tell him she was a nice woman, but he knew better. Anyhow, she became restless around the house with nothing to do except her husband, so she made up her mind to be benevolent. She decided that she would allow the glory of her presence to burst upon the poor and the uncultured. It would be a big help to the poor and uncultured to see what a real razzmatazz lady was like. She didn't propose to put on old clothes and go and live with the poor people and be one of them and nurse their sick, as they do in settlements, not on your previous existence. She was going to be benevolent and be dead swell at the same time. Accordingly, she would lace herself until she was the shape of a bass viol, put on a hat that made her face seem longer, and then she would gallop forth to do things to the poor. She always carried a 99-cent lorgnette in one hand and a smelling bottle in the other. Now, she would say, feeling behind to make sure that she was all strung up, now to carry sunshine into the lowly places. As soon as she began stalking her prey, the small children would crawl under the beds. They knew how to stand off the rent man and the dog catcher, but when 235 pounds of sunshine came wafting up the street, they felt they were up against a new game. The benevolent lady would go into a house numbered 1135A with a marking brush, and after she had sized up the front door with her lorgnette, she would say, "My good woman, does your husband drink?" "Oh, yes, sir," the grateful woman would reply. "That is, when he's working, he gets $1.10. "And what does he do with all his money?" the benevolent lady would ask. "I think he plays the stock market," would be the reply. Then the benevolent lady would say, "When the unfortunate man comes home this evening, you tell him that a kind and beautiful lady called and asked him please to stop drinking, except a glass of claret at dinner, and to be sure and read 8 or 10 pages from the Encyclopedia Britannica each night before retiring. Also tell him to be sure and save his money. Is that your child out of the bed?" "Yes, that's little William J." "How many have you?" 8 or 9, I forget which." "Well, be sure and dress them in sanitary underwear. You can get it for $4 a suit. Will you be good enough to have the little boy come from under the bed and spell Ibex for the sweet lady?" "He's afraid of you. Kindly explain to him that I take an interest in him, even though he is the offspring of an obscure and ignorant working man, while I am probably the grandest thing that ever swept up the boulevard. I must go now, but I will return. Next time I come, I hope to hear that your husband has stopped drinking and is very happy. Tell the small person under the bed that if he learns to spell Ibex by the time I call again, I will let him look at my rings. As for you, bear in mind that it is no disgrace to be poor. It is simply inconvenient. That's all." In this manner, the benevolent lady carried forward the good work and dazzled the whole region between O'Hara's box factory and the city dump. But one day, a scrappy kid, whose mother didn't have any lorgnette or diamond earbobs, spotted the benevolent lady. The benevolent lady had been in the house telling his mother that it was a glorious privilege to wash for a living. And after the benevolent lady went away, the kid's mother sat down and had a good cry, and the scrappy kid thought it was up to him. He went out to an alley and found a tomato can that was not working, and he waited. In a little while, the benevolent lady came out of a basement in which she had been telling a Polish family to look at her and be happy. The scrappy kid let drive, and the tomato can struck the benevolent lady between the shoulder blades. She squawked and started to run, fell over a garbage box, and had to be picked up by a policeman. She went home in a cab, told her husband that the Liquor League had tried to assassinate her because she was reforming so many drunkards. That settled it with her. She said she wouldn't try to be benevolent anymore. The scrappy kid grew up to be a corrupt alderman and gave his mother plenty of good clothes, which she was always afraid to wear. Moral, in uplifting, get underneath. The world of Mark Twain seems so very far away from us. Today, that half-wild, innocent America of his childhood memories is a lost continent, sunk forever under those arid deserts of asphalt, those oceans of poison sludge, those mountains of technological garbage, which are the monuments of the human dilemma we like to call progress. It's nice, though, to catch a glimpse of things as they used to be. And here's a landscape painted in words to bring us back for a moment to that early morning of the American day, so blithe and free, when we were still on speaking terms of Mother Earth. The scene, the greatest of all rivers, the Mississippi. The speaker, Huckleberry Finn. Two or 3 days, nights went by. I reckon I might say they swum by. They slid along so quiet and smooth and lovely. It was a monstrous big river down there, sometimes 1.5 miles wide. As soon as night was most gone, we stopped navigating and tied up. And then we set out the lines. Next, we slid into the river and had a swim so as to freshen up and cool off. Then we sat down on the sandy bottom where the water was about knee-deep. Watched the daylight come. Not a sound anywhere. It's perfectly still, just like the whole world was asleep. Only sometimes the bullfrogs are cluttering, maybe. Then the river softened up way off. And weren't black anymore, but gray. You could see little dark spots drifting along ever so far away, trading scows and such things, and long black streaks. Rafts. Sometimes you could hear a sweep squeaking or jumbled up voices. It was so still and sounds come so far. You could see the mist curl up off the water and the east redden up, and you make out a log cabin in the edge of the woods way on the bank, on the other side of the river. Then the nice breeze springs up, so cool and fresh and sweet to smell on account of the woods and the flowers. Sometimes not that way because they leave dead fish laying around, gars and such, and they do get pretty rank. Next you got the full day, and everything's smiling in the sun, and the songbirds just go in it, and we take some fish off the lines and cook up a hot breakfast, and afterwards we'd watch the lonesomeness of the river and kind of lazy along, and by, lazy off to sleep. Wake up by and by. Maybe see a steamboat coughing along upstream. So far off toward the other side you couldn't tell nothing about her, whether she was a stern wheel or a side wheel. Then for about an hour there would be nothing to hear, nothing to see. Just solid lonesomeness. Next you'd see a raft sliding by way off yonder. Maybe a galoot on it chopping, because they're most always doing it on a raft. You'd see the axe flash and come down, and you don't hear nothing. You see that axe go up again, and by the time it's above the man's head, you hear the chunk. It took all that time to come over the water. So we put in the day, lazing around, listening to the stillness. So it was night, out we shoved. Got her out about the middle, we'd let her alone and let her float wherever the current wanted her to go. We lit the pipes and dangled our legs in the water and talked about all kinds of things. We was always naked, day and night, whenever the mosquitoes would let us. We had the sky up there, all speckled with stars. Used to lay on our backs and look up at them and discuss about whether they was made or only just happened. Jim, he allowed they was made, but I allowed they happened. I judged it would have took too long to make so many. Jim said the moon could have laid them. Well, that looked kind of reasonable, so I didn't say nothing against it, because I seen a frog lay most as many, so of course it could be done. We used to watch the stars that fell, too, and see them streak down, and Jim allowed they got spoiled and was hove out of the nest. Once or twice of a night, we'd see a steamboat slipping along in the dark, and now and then she'd belch a whole world of sparks up out of her chimneys. They'd rain down on the river and look awful pretty. And she'd turn a corner, and her lights would wink out, and her powwow shut off, and leave the river still again. By and by, her waves would get to us a long time after she was gone. Juggle the raft a bit. After that, you wouldn't hear nothing, for you couldn't tell how long, except maybe frogs or something. Sometimes we'd have that whole river all to ourselves for the longest time. Yonder was the banks and the islands across the water, maybe a spark, which was a candle in a cabin window, and sometimes on the water you could see a spark or two, on a raft or a scow, you know. Maybe you could hear a fiddle or a song coming up from one of them crafts. It's lovely to live on a raft. Well, Mark Twain, of course, was also, and perhaps fundamentally, a comic writer, the greatest our country has produced, but in this field he's far from alone. From Artemus Ward to Thurber, from Lardner to Benchley to Perlman, our literature has been, at least up to now, very rich in comedy, maybe the richest in the world. It looks all right at night. If it's dark enough. You can't see the smog. If you're far enough away, a big city still wears a certain glamour. With the right amount of distance, that hectic electric flush, that feverish neon could seem positively festive. G.K. Chesterton once said of the famous bright lights of Broadway that they made a grander display than any fireworks, that no spectacle was ever more beautiful for anyone who couldn't read. A lot of good men in our literature had their say about big cities, usually New York, pro and con. And it's the small-town boys, mostly, who've done the best job. Thomas Wolfe was one of those. As a sample. The city is the place where men are doomed to wandering forever. Of no place is this more true than of New York. Hideously ugly for the most part, one yet remembers it as a place of proud and passionate beauty. A place of everlasting hunger. In no place in the world can the life of the lonely boy, the countryman who's been drawn northwards to the flame of his lust, be more barren, more drab, more hungry and comfortless. His life is the life of subways, of rebreathed air, of the smell of burned steel, weariness and exhausted fetidity of a cheap rented room in the apartment of a nice couple on the 113th Street, or perhaps the triumph of an $80 apartment in Brooklyn, Upper Manhattan, or the Bronx, which he rents with 3 or 4 other youths, and here they can do as they please. A romantic aspiration which leads to Saturday night parties, cheap gin, cheap girls. If the youth is of a serious bent, if he has thoughts of improving himself, there is the gigantic desolation of the public library. A cut-rate ticketed graze and a seat in the balcony of an art theater that's been highly praised that all intellectual people will be seeing. Again, there's something unreal in almost all attempts at established life in the city. One always has the feeling that the effort to achieve permanence in this impermanent and constantly changing life is no more real than the suggested permanence in a theatrical setting. One would not be surprised to return the next morning and find the scene dismantled, the stage bare, and the actors departed. Sometimes even the simplest social acts, the act of visiting one's friends, of talking to them in a room, of sitting around a hearth fire with them, above all else, of sitting around a hearth fire in an apartment in the city, seem naked, pitiful. In the city, it's appalling to think of how much pain and hunger people, and particularly young men, have suffered. They return after their day's work to a room which, despite all efforts to trick it out with a neat bed, bright colors, a few painted bookshelves, a few pictures, is obviously only a masked cell. Every instinct, every deep conviction of a man is for reasonable comfort, and that's outraged. He knows that every man on earth should have the decency of space enough to extend his limbs and draw in the air without fear of labor, and he knows that his life here in this miserable closet is base, barren, mean, and naked. It's therefore astonishing that nowhere in the world can a young man feel greater hope and expectancy than here. The promise of glorious fulfillment, of love, wealth, fame, of unimaginable joy is always impending in the air. In New York, there are certain wonderful seasons in which this feeling grows to lyrical intensity. One of these are the first tender days of spring, when lovely girls and women seem suddenly to burst out of the pavements like flowers. All at once, the street is peopled with them, walking along with proud, undulant rhythm of breasts and buttocks and a look of passionate tenderness in their faces. Another season is autumn. In October, when the city begins to take on a magnificent flash and sparkle, there are swift whippings of bright wind, a flare of bitter leaves, the smell of frost and harvest in the air. After the enervation of summer, the place awakens to an electric vitality. The beautiful women have come back from Europe or from the summer resorts. The air is charged with exultancy and joy. Finally, there's a wonderful secret thrill of some impending ecstasy on a frozen winter's night, when the cold is so intense that it numbs one's flesh, and the sky above the city flashes with one deep jewelry of cold stars. The whole city, no matter how ugly its parts may be, seems to soar up with an aspirant, vertical, glittering magnificence to meet the stars. One hears the hoarse notes of the great ships in the river, Suddenly New York blazes like a magnificent jewel in its fit setting of sea and earth, the stars. There's no place like it. No place with an atom of its glory, pride, and exultancy. It lays its hand upon a man's bowels. He grows drunk with ecstasy. He grows young and full of glory. He feels that he can never die. Well, Tom Wolfe, who wrote those words, died young. I was lucky enough to meet him before he died. Well, my father was fairly well along in years when I was born. Yet it's always been something of an astonishment to remember that he was actually a friend of Mark Twain's.